You are listening to CEO Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to this episode of CEO Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. CEO Perspectives take an in-depth, timely look at a range of topics that matter most to business leaders. To help make sense of these topics and how they'll unfold, we'll sit down with thought leaders and do what we do best at the Conference Board, provide trusted insights for what's ahead. I'm Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board and the host of this series. And today we're talking about sustainability in the food system. There are 7.3 billion people on Earth today, and the strain on our ecosystems is immense. We're trying to feed everybody, but how do we produce more without expanding the land and water use? And what should countries and companies be doing to address human needs but preserve our environment? Joining me today is Carter Roberts, the President and CEO of the World Wildlife Fund in the United States. Carter, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to be here.
So, Carter, you have an incredible level of experience for all of this. Of course, you run the World Wildlife Fund, but you've been in and around food and consumer products. You have an MBA from Harvard. You've been a part of the companies, and you've been now part of the World Wildlife Fund for a long time. Just tell us a little bit more about your career in the business world and how that is intersected this whole topic of sustainability.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Careers are a funny thing. They sometimes are not quite linear, and mine would be one of those. I got out of college, and I looked at some of the basic training programs in the world, and I had the good fortune to start off my career at Procter & Gamble in their food products division, since we're talking about food. And I learned a lot about how companies source food, how they package it, how they distribute it, how they market it, and all the dynamics there. Went on to business school, came out, worked for another large company that is now part of Procter & Gamble, and then eventually went to work for the Nature Conservancy, where I spent 15 years, and it was all about conserving lands, and lands have lots of competition for their use, whether it's for conservation, whether it's for food, whether it's for development. And then I left that organization 18 years ago to join WWF, from one very large organization to another that is even more global. And when we took a look at the things that affected the places we cherish most in the world, like the Amazon or the Pacific or the Northern Great Plains, unsustainable food production topped the list of things that were changing those places, even more than climate change. And unsustainable food production turns out to be a main driver of climate change. So it's been a big part of our work, and I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and at one time, people were saying that once we crossed the threshold of 4 billion people on Earth, we were just simply not going to be able to feed them. And it's interesting that the WWF objective is to produce enough food to nourish everyone while reducing the environmental footprint. So that seems kind of counterintuitive. And now with 7.3 billion people on Earth, obviously things have changed. We've been able to adapt and to feed everyone. But now again, the strain on our ecosystems is immense. So how do we do it, Carter? How do we now escalate and feed even more people while reducing this eco footprint?
Well, regardless of our goals at WWF, if you look at the World Economic Forum and the main threats to the global economy, of the top threats they list are loss of biodiversity, climate change, drought, all of which leads to the inability of societies to feed themselves. And with bad governance, then people move and migration occurs and destabilization occurs. And particularly with the war in the Ukraine right now, it's gotten even worse. So it is a huge challenge for us. If we do our job poorly, the world will destroy all the nature on Earth to plant crops in an unsustainable way to feed people. And in the end, we will wake up and realize that we had lost nature that is fundamental to the production of food. So how do we get a handle on that? First of all, we're going to go way past 7.3 billion, Steve. We're going to, the best estimates is we're going to get up to 11 billion. And the question is, how do we feed the world without destroying the planet? The biggest things we see, the biggest starting point really should be food waste. We waste anywhere from 30 to 40% of food. In Africa, that food is lost at the point of production. It gets eaten by rats or bugs before it even gets to market. And in places like the United States, it is lost in institutions in the form of waste, and it's lost in our own households because we buy too much, we don't eat it, we throw it away. And that is the starting point. The other point is at place of production, the best forms of food production use a lot less land, a lot less energy, and a lot less water than the worst forms. And so it's all about finding the right kind of financial incentives, technologies, and supply chain requirements that move production to sustainable forms of production, which is what we need.
Yeah. Now, so, it's interesting because even in the United States, which, we think of ourselves as pretty good at this, from a farming standpoint, there are new lessons being learned today on sustainable farming. And, we're learning that our farmers have been doing it wrong, that simply plowing and exposing the dirt, and plowing everything under and opening up the soil releases a lot of carbon. Therefore, you get a lot of runoff and silt into the systems, and it's poor water use, on and on and on. But this is the way we've been doing agriculture for a couple hundred years. So even now, even in the US, there's a huge, huge opportunity to be more efficient with our resources.
No, that's right. It is an eye-opener to go into the prairie and to look at the different ways that people grow crops, and to take out a chunk of the land, let's say a meter square, and those farmers that enabled the soil to be rich, that enabled grasses to be in the mix and kept the ecosystem intact. When you pour water into that kind of plot, it is retained. When you pour it into the situation you just described, the water runs off, it runs through, and it takes the soil with it. So you're essentially destroying the very soil you need to grow things. And so there are many approaches, from cover crop, which essentially means planting grasses in and amongst the things that you're growing. There is rotational agriculture. There is no-till, where you essentially are not plowing those big furrows in the ground. You're precision planting seeds with points in the ground that keep the soil intact. And all of that is available. It's all there. The best farmers do it. We just need government policies, and we need supply chain requirements to provide farmers with incentives to do the right thing.
Yeah, and that's just in the United States. But then there's this whole education process that needs to happen, and you're involved with that through WWF around the world. What does that take? Is that just all on the governments, or is that too public-private partnership requirement?
Steve, I think the kind of food people eat around the world is highly varied. And although wheat in and of itself is a huge geopolitical force, prices of wheat go up, conflicts occur, and then insecurity is rampant. But what we have found is it requires public-private partnerships of the highest order, governments to provide the right kind of subsidies, get rid of the wrong kind of subsidies, and for companies to innovate on technology, and companies to also use their power and influence. And by that, I mean companies that have big supply chains, companies that you and I both know. You sit on the board of one of those companies, that when they buy products to sell in their stores, or they buy raw materials, is to look all the way through their supply chains to the point of production, whether it's in South America or Africa or elsewhere, and to know what the impact of that food production was. Did it cause deforestation? Did it replenish soil or destroy it? Not to mention other impacts. And then for those companies that know that information to then require that their supply chains are populated by raw materials and commodities that are grown in a sustainable way, and to turn away the products that are not.
Yeah, and so this public-private partnership thing, it's hard to say PPP, but it is an important thing because there's been a lot of debate over the years. Should it be either the public sector or the private sector? And it can't be one or the other. They have to work in concert, and they have to sing from the same songbook on this because people, there are best practices here, and there's just so much learning. Talk about the mix of food. There's been a lot of discussion about grain-based and plant-based food versus protein, which is does other things. What is the right mix of food for the planet?
Well, I think when you look at the embedded carbon, the embedded deforestation, the embedded water use in the diets that we have right now, it is clear that we could and should eat differently if we care not just about our own health, but also about the health of the planet. And so the more we know about what is required to produce beef or soy or the inputs to all the various foods that we consume, the more clear it is that we need to move our diets more in the direction of fruits and vegetables, more in the directions of some grains, and then to create a much more balanced diet that's not so heavy on beef, not so heavy on chicken or pork or the like. And we're beginning to see societies already shift their diets. You're seeing that in the United States. It's not accidental that McDonald's and Burger King are now selling a plant-based burger. And you're seeing it in Europe as people adopt more planet-friendly diets. And it turns out it actually, in many cases, tastes better. So I think we can get a long way there toward making food production more sustainable through technology, through innovations, but we can't get all of the way there and balancing out food production with the carrying capacity of the planet unless we change our diets at the same time.
No, and the production of animal proteins requires all of the production of grain and plant-based food to then feed the animals. And then a huge source of global warming is from the methane produced by those animals. So there you've got that negative effect. And then it's, saturated fat and, too much protein is bad for you. So the whole thing, it really is, the perfect storm. And the really perfect solution here is more plant-based food, not only, with carbs, but there's a lot of great protein from plant-based food. So this is really the right cycle to lead into, and then to produce it in a sustainable way. So, at WWF talks about this in terms of, I think your terminology is resilient food systems. You talk a little bit more about what that means. What is the resilient part of it, and what needs to change from where we are to get to where you think we need to be?
Yeah, well, let me say one last thing on meat, which is, I am not saying that we need to eliminate meat from our diet. In certain parts of the world, the best use of landscapes to provide protein and nutrition to people is, in fact, through ungulates and through grazers, and because there's no other way to use those lands to grow food. And there are also innovations in the kind of inputs you provide to plant-based protein that reduce methane. And we're doing some really interesting work in investing in the production of seaweed and then turning it into an input for beef that reduces the output from the cows themselves. An increasing, what I see in our world right now is the increasing importance of resilience. And resilience is a resonant word all the way across the board. It is the resilience of human communities to survive catastrophes, droughts, and conflict. It's the resilience of nature and how we use it. And at the base of both concepts of resilience is the imperative for us to build a society that not only can sustain itself over time, but to build a society that sustains the planet upon which we fundamentally depend. And so resilient food systems look like this. They are grown in a way that has great economy of motion. And by that, I mean they are often grown locally with crops that are relevant in the context of those societies rather than spreading a monoculture of food across the world. They are grown in a way that uses only as much water as those systems require and no more. That is very careful about husbanding the inputs, whether it's water, whether it's energy, whether it's land. And resilient systems also model the effect of climate change so that you're constantly testing, tracking the production of food under different climate conditions so that farmers know what kind of seeds to plant when the climate changes. And by the way, the climate is changing all around us right now. So it's basically, Wayne Gretzky always said, I always skate to where the puck is going to be. That's what we need to do with food systems, is to predict the future and to provide farmers with the ability to grow the kind of crops that can survive.
We're talking with Carter Roberts about sustainability and resilience. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
As you and your company monitor the latest wave of shocks that have battered the U.S. economy, the award-winning forecast team at the Conference Board now predicts a U.S. recession by the end of 2022. This recession will further compound the crises that have recently upended expectations, from a deadly pandemic to a war in Ukraine and the highest inflation rate in decades. Yet, unprecedented crises also present unforeseen opportunities if you have a trusted, proven navigator by your side. With that in mind, the Conference Board continues its long-standing tradition of providing timely and relevant content on a daily basis to help guide the business community through the economic storm. These trusted insights are being gathered on our website and are available to help your company master the challenges ahead. Chart a course for the future, which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side by visiting our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession, located at www.conference-board.org/topics/recession.
Welcome back to CEO Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland, the CEO of the Conference Board, and we're talking to Carter Roberts, the CEO of the World Wildlife Fund here in the United States. So Carter, WWF has a goal of halting the conversion and deforestation of natural habitats for food production, and at the same time reducing the use of water, energy, and so forth. What are some of the strategies that you're recommending that we can use?
So this is a big part of our work. WWF, everyone thinks by our name and our logo that we're all about saving fuzzy animals, but the majority of our work is really about keeping intact these big systems on Earth that are fundamental to our lives and the lives of all the other creatures with whom we share the planet. So I'll give you an example in the Amazon. The Amazon is vast. It's the biggest tropical forest on Earth. It's 84% intact. It is home to thousands of terrestrial species. It's also home to thousands of aquatic species because of the river. And it is home to all kinds of indigenous communities. The scientists predict that if you drop below 80% forest cover, that something will happen in the Amazon that will be catastrophic for us all. And that is, the Amazon right now cycles water from the Atlantic in a hydrological cycle that then bumps up against the Andes and then dumps rain in the second biggest breadbasket in the world. After the United States, Brazil is the biggest producer of food commodities in the world. If we dip below 80%, the forest will convert to savanna, we'll lose the hydrological cycle, And not only will we lose all the forms of life there, we will lose the viability of that breadbasket with catastrophic consequences. So the techniques we use to keep that forest intact start with parks and expanding park systems throughout the Amazon. We worked with the government of Brazil in creating a system of parks in the Amazon equal to 1.5 Californias, the biggest park system in the world by size. We then worked with producers of soy to create a moratorium on soy produced in the Amazon. And soy, by the way, planting soy was the leading cause of deforestation, so that they would only grow soy on land that had already lost its trees, and they wouldn't buy and distribute soy that required cutting down trees. And then the last technique is a government regulation. It requires any farmer, if you're going to plant crops, you have to have many multiples the size of that land under production to be set aside in standing forests. So with those three things in the Amazon, we halted deforestation for a while. It plummeted. Now it's beginning to rise again with a changing government. The government may change again, and we may see it go down again. But those are the biggest techniques, Steve. And I've just come back from 9 days in Colombia, where we celebrated that country, one of the first in the world, set aside 37% of their oceans and 31% of their land in a glittering park system. Compare that to the United States, where we have 12% of our land set aside in parks.
Yeah, I mean, this can't be understated, the impact of the whole Amazon region on the globe, whether it's global climate, global water, global temperature. What some of the greatest carbon storage devices are trees, and there's a lot of carbon being stored through the Amazon. So
that's right.
And once you reach that tipping point, I didn't realize it was as high as 80%, but once you hit that tipping point and you start converting, you end up with a Sahara Desert style situation. If you look back over history, that was not a desert in Northern Africa. That was forest, and you can find the fossils there. So, these things do happen. And, in the course of, ecological history, it happens quickly, and it should be taken very seriously here. Part of stopping global warming is not creating more. And this is part of the challenge here. So I really think that the work that you're doing is critically important. A big key to that too is water. And, I think that as you look at the sustainability of people, what if 11 billion is a lot of people, a big piece of that is water. Talk about what we're doing with water. Why are there shortages? What can we do differently there?
So I spent this past week with long conversations with colleagues about water. And the fundamental difference between water and climate change is water is a very local issue. In climate change, a ton of carbon or greenhouse gases emitted in the US affects places all around the world, and vice versa. Water is extremely local. And all you have to do is look at the headlines from California or from the Sudan or from different parts of the world to know just how much water shortages wreak havoc on societies, on economies, and how important it is to get a handle on this. The first thing you've got to keep in mind is that the vast majority of water we don't use, we don't have access to. It's either frozen in ice caps, it's in the ocean, but in terms of fresh water, only a very small fraction of it is available to us. And of that small fraction, the vast majority of it goes to agriculture. That's the first thing. So finding new ways to grow crops with a lot less water is fundamentally important. And also to think about the kind of crops you grow. Some are some crops are thirsty crops, and some crops are less so. The other thing is we don't have enough transparency in monitoring of water use and water flows throughout the West and the different parts of the world. Information is power, and by looking at the long-term trajectories and changes And you combine that with the ability of regulators to make decisions about the allocation of water in different parts of the world, then that gives you another tool to use. And then finally, there's the idea of looking at water systems and water flows, water quality as important as standing forests. And so some countries like Mexico are creating laws to essentially conserve and protect those water flows as if they were standing forests and parks. And when the water flows dip beneath a certain level, to make decisions to reallocate and redistribute water use, not just to companies, but to people, but to reduce the overall use to keep those flows intact. There are a lot of methods we need to use. And I would mention one last thing, since I was just in the Andes. The one thing we have learned is that the importance of forests in conserving watersheds. New York City, many, many years ago, had a choice between creating a very expensive water filtration plant as part of the Clean Water Act, and it had a choice between that or creating a park in the Catskills and to source the water from there, because standing forests act like a sponge. They retain water, they filter it. And to this day, New York City has the best water of any big city in the United States, not because of some big expensive plant, but because of some big standing forest. And countries in the Andes are doing the same. And that's one of the more interesting ways of keeping water quality and flows intact.
Yeah, and we're an interconnected world. This whole thing about, well, we'll work on it over here and then just ignore the other side of the world. It doesn't work, because 12 hours later you're spinning through the same air. The metaphor breaks down, but it is one climate, it is one atmosphere, and so it is important that we all work together globally and to have a consensus here on what the objectives are.
Steve, if you look at all the agencies in the U.S. government, the one part of the U.S. government that is consistently focused on the issue of sustainability, on forests, on water, and on climate, it is the Department of Defense. Because they look around the world, they see what happens when you lose flows of water, when you lose your ability to grow food, when you lose predictable weather and climate. And their models show over a very long period of time the catastrophe that ensues, the migrations, the wars that will break out when any part of the world goes paws up in terms of its sustainability. And so we're learning, and all you have to do is look at the ripple effects of closing down the flow of oil or wheat from the Ukraine in recent events, just how interconnected we are. And it is very much in our own self-interest to make sure every part of the world is resilient and food production is sustainable, and that we invest in that, not just at home, but overseas.
Incredibly wise words. Carter Roberts, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about these issues. Your audience is profoundly important. Leadership in companies in the C-suite is one of the most critical factors in determining whether companies are a force for good in these areas, and also whether companies develop the comparative advantage of solving the problems that the world faces. So thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, that's great. And thanks to all of you for listening in to CEO Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by an expert in their field to talk about the issues of our time. We'll talk about topics in geopolitics, economics, human capital, marketing communications, public policy, and more. Please share CEO Perspectives with your colleagues. I know that they're going to want to listen. Share them with your family, with your neighbors. It's important. I'm Steve Odland, and this podcast and webcast have been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Conference Board, the indispensable ally that has helped businesses through war, recession, and economic transformation for over 100 years. As recent unexpected economic challenges persist, you can chart a course for the future which will allow your business to emerge stronger on the other side. Just visit our free economic hub entitled Navigating the Economic Storm, your indispensable guide through the global recession, located at www.conference-board.org/topics/recession.